I don't understand why it went to yellow versus the red and white.
This is a whole series of conversations that went on for almost a year. Well, what does red mean? Red means stop. What does yellow mean? Proceed with caution. So what's the intent of this symbol? Is cannabis something that is dangerous and you should stop and not use? Or is it something that you should be aware of and proceed with caution?
I've built and sold 2 companies for over $25 million. With 25 years of experience in tech and now in cannabis, I know how to scale, sell, and win in this industry. If you want to learn how to turn ideas into profit, you're in the right place. David Vaillencourt, founder of GMP Collective and vice chairman of ASTM's Cannabis Committee, is leading the charge on good manufacturing practices. From ensuring product safety to fighting off contaminants like Aspergillus, which I learned how to say, and pesticides, he's here to explain why GMP is critical to the industry's survival and how collaboration is key to setting the standards we all need.
Hey, Jason. Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm David Vaillencourt. I wear a few different hats in this industry. I've been around in the space since essentially 2017. I am the founder and CEO of the GMP Collective, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about later. GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practices. I'm also the vice chairman for the Global Committee on Cannabis Standards through ASTM International, Committee D37. Perhaps we'll get to talk a bit more about that rabbit hole and voluntary consensus standards and that volunteer organization of about 800 members across 40 countries and growing. And then because that wasn't enough, in last year I founded recognizing that there's still this gap in bridging the gap between science, standards, and policy, and ensuring what product safety is. I helped found and launch a 501c3 nonprofit, the S3 Collective, which stands for Standards, Science, and Safety, which I'm the board chairman of.
Oh, fantastic. That is a mouthful. There's a lot of words in there that I don't fully recognize, so this is going to be very interesting. And, you know, I like to invite people on who we can learn from as an industry. I guess I typically represent, or I'm a representative of the Massachusetts cannabis industry. And you're here on a visit. Where are you coming in from?
Yeah, so home for me, I currently reside in Colorado Springs, but I will say I grew up in South Shore in Massachusetts. So it's so exciting. Yeah, so it's just so exciting to like get to come
always
home.
Back here.
Yeah, I get to come back and then get to talk about cannabis in my home state where I grew up. Pretty amazing.
Yeah. So, all right, let's start at the GMP side. Good manufacturing practices. Mm-hmm. So that sounds like something we should be doing. We should be doing good manufacturing practices.
Yeah, we should have good practices, right?
Exactly.
You know, just
SOPs, like everything should be lined up correctly, and we should obviously, with us particularly, food safety is obviously very, very paramount for making sure we only put out high quality products. Mm-hmm. So I guess take me a little through GMP. Where did it come from? Why does it exist?
Yeah, so GMPs have been around more or less since the 60s. There's a we'll try to be careful with the alphabet acronym soup today. Might get a little dangerous. I don't know what I owe for each acronym I throw out there, but you know, back in the 60s, we were putting people in space and needed to figure out a way to make sure that there was no food safety issues, foodborne illnesses, that astronauts would not get sick. Yeah,
that's where GMP come from.
That was one of the main roots.
The science, and it's so interesting that people always say like government wastes so much money on things and stuff like that, but born out of a lot of these programs are really good things like GMP.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there was an issue with food safety in space.
Yeah. So figuring out how do we ensure like the shelf life stability of these products are safe and aren't going to get people sick. So HACCP, the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, which is
going to get
like
charged
the foundation. I know it's going to be so expensive. That'll be part of the this or that quiz at the end, right? But Pillsbury, the Navy, and NASA worked together and came up with that program, which is one of the foundations of good manufacturing practices to ensure that your risks are controlled. So what could cause you to get sick? Metal shavings, probably not great, right? Chemical, pesticides or solvents, right?
Stuff.
Especially in the cannabis space, or the biologics, mold.
Right.
Microbial issues. Yeah. So that was really the birth of it. And, one thing we take for granted in our society that you go to the grocery store and you can trust that this food is relatively safe. That's because good manufacturing practices are the basic minimum. These are the minimum requirements that the World Health Organization references and uses globally, that the FDA requires, Health Canada, pretty much every country for any medicine, dietary supplement, natural product, or food that we consume.
Who enforces this?
So
The Board of Health? Is it like, because there's standards for things, but who's the actual, does somebody come in and say, hey, you're doing it wrong and do it better?
So the way I look at it maybe is take, whether it's your Stop and Shop or your Costco, your grocery store, when they select what products go on the shelves there, they don't just say, oh, are you FDA compliant? They go out and they do their own third party inspection. And they have their own criteria that's above and beyond the FDA's minimum requirements, because the FDA has limited resources. They audit a facility on average every 3 years in the food world.
Wow.
So there's a lot of food facilities, and then don't even get me started on the international aspect. So a lot of it is actually third party, and it's mandated by the buyers, by the brands, to ensure that products are safe.
That their risk is way more if they have a recall or something like that happens.
Bingo. You nailed it. It's a risk reduction strategy. It's to ensure that products are safe. How do we trust that brand is not going to get consumers sick and end up in a recall and some foodborne outbreak?
So if you're like a traditional CPG company outside of cannabis, you can expect the buyers to I guess the buyers are kind of probably more focused on buying, but there's a group within Stop and Shop that's going to have to show up at the facility and say, all right, let me see your GMP certifications, plus let's take a walkthrough and let's see how you do things.
Yep.
And they'll check off a box or two and they'll be like, all right, we can buy this product.
Essentially, yep. They're going to go in and do their own supplier qualification to ensure, that the sanitary controls are there, that, you've got pest mitigation steps, that you're qualifying your raw ingredients, where are you buying your sugar from? Is your packaging going to have a compatibility issue and affect product quality on the down the road?
And so some of these people are maybe like food scientists as well, because they're going to know the interactions between these different materials, because one of the big things in cannabis very early on was the plastic liners in cans, right?
Yep.
So in drinks, plastic liners. So for quality control, you take one off the line, it contains 5 milligrams of THC. You're like, all right, we did it. But 6 months later, it now contains 1 milligram of THC. And everybody's like, well, how did that happen? Right. And so one of the theories that were put forth back then, and there's other factors, including dissolved oxygen being an issue, which is another quality control standard that you have to meet now. But it was the plastic liners were absorbing the THC. And it's not something you'd pick up right from the line. It's something that you have to wait. So now you have to accelerate that, or you have to somehow ensure 6 months later that the product still actually is robust.
Yeah, what's shelf stable, right? We have our milk has a best by date, our medicine has, expiration dates. Pretty much all of our products have expiration dates because, not everything lasts for forever. And the same thing with cannabis and especially beverages and food products.
I think it's funny though, because it is really like in Massachusetts cannabis, it's so interesting because I talk to our Board of Health sometimes, just because I'm friendly in the town. I go to the town administrator's office occasionally. I talk to the town administrator, and I'll also stop in sometimes to the food inspector just to be like, what's going on? My son just got licensed for his food-based business, for instance, and I had to talk to our Board of Health. And so when I'm talking to them, they've told me basically that the CCC, the Cannabis Control Commission, is they won't step foot in our facility. We invited them in because we try to do everything above board and super high quality. So we invited our Board of Health in to look at everything we were doing, because we wanted to make sure that that if we were to get inspected by them, they would approve everything that we've been up doing at this point. And we invited them in. He recommended, Derek is his name. He recommended like a few changes. Like, oh, you should try to think about it from this perspective and all those other things. And it was actually very helpful to have them in there. However, he basically said, it is outside of my purview. It's up to the CCC to ensure food safety. And I'm just like, but they don't. The investigators are coming in here. They're looking at diversion. They're like, where are the security cameras and all these other things? So there's a gap in food safety here. And of course, we're doing it we believe we're doing it the best we can. But we're also, in a lot of cannabis companies, these are people who are like, maybe never even had a business before. They just love weed.
Yep.
And so now they're like, hey, I love weed. I'm going to get into the business. And all of a sudden they start making edibles with no real food safety background outside of maybe they took a ServSafe and that's it.
Right. You've nailed what keeps me up at night, right? And the industry, and I don't fault anybody. We all, whether we're industry, regulators, it's a complicated situation that got us to the current state of affairs in the United States with our cannabis programs, adult and medical use. When it got started, you think back to like the Cole memo. And what was the focus for states to comply and not have the feds raid our marketplace? Don't have diversion, right? So track and trace, make sure it's not getting into the hands of minors and it's not going out of state.
Right.
Those were essentially the principles. Where's food safety? Where's consumer medical? And this was back in the day of medical cannabis, right? We weren't even talking adult use. So now we're here, 2024, 15 plus years later, we've learned, wait, we should probably be worried about the safety of products. We didn't even have lab testing back in the day when these programs got started in Colorado and Washington State. So it's a new thing, and it's not typical of these agencies to have those resources. It's usually done at the federal level.
And I feel like there is that discrepancy definitely on the education side, but also on the, not policy side, but the oversight side. But at the same time, I don't want more regulation. I don't want more oversight. We're a good operator. We're not trying to add additional policies in place here because it's already so overburdensome to even just operate in this industry. The last thing I want is the CCC to start hiring inspectors to come in just for food safety. However, I think it's a good idea, but maybe as part of their normal course of action of like, hey, we're going to come in and investigate, but we're also bringing a food scientist with us to just verify a couple things. I think that would be very helpful. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of manufacturers are just like, stick a year on it. We can go to a year expiration.
That's what Colorado did. That was the compromise. I worked on that rulemaking task group, and the compromise was in the absence of data, because you need to show data to ensure to demonstrate when's the product going to be start to sour. So they just put a default 1 year expiration date on all products, regardless of what that means.
Whatever that means. And so it's funny because it's like the marketplace is leading the charge. Right, the market, and that's capitalism. It's just like we're going to just put out products and we're just going to see what happens. And then the science is kind of a little bit behind that, or a lot sometimes, depending on, because of federal legalization and stuff like that. The research has kind of been kicked to overseas like Israel. But behind that's the policymakers even. It's just like we don't even know, because the science, especially in Massachusetts right now, there's all this lab talks, right, about like how microbials work and stuff like that. And I can't pronounce half the words, like Aspergillus or whatever it is. And then the policymakers are behind them being like, okay, now we have to start listening to these labs because they're trying to make it safer, which makes sense. But at the same time, the marketplace is just rocketing ahead.
It's a really, dare I say, broken system that was kind of set up to fail from the get-go, where we didn't know what we didn't know as states. And, sometimes it's legislators that put these laws forward that kind of box us in, or it's a ballot-led initiative. And so how does that get interpreted into rules? And do they even have the appropriations and resources to have scientists on staff? A lot of these states don't even have scientists on staff, and they're not given the resources to do that. So we don't end up getting any of that food safety oversight. And then you mentioned the lab situation. Like, we're the only industry that requires third-party mandatory testing. The food industry, you qualify your testing lab and you ensure that they're going to give you the safe results, and then you as a brand owner trust and you've qualified those results. So it's on you, not on the lab, to give the best result. They're supposed to give the most accurate result.
Right. And that is one of the things that we try to do here, is when we're sourcing different materials and stuff like that through our supply chain, we're always asking for the lab results, being like, how pure is this, and whatever ingredient it might be, like, show me the labs on it, safe to date SDS, safe to data sheets and stuff like that too, just to verify like toxicity and all this other stuff. But I guess, have there been incidents in maybe Massachusetts cannabis where there was like a recall or a safety issue where GMP would have obviously helped solve a lot of that?
I would say 100%. And I can't think of any mass examples off the top of my head, but I've been doing a lot of work in California and watching the recalls.
Yeah, give me an example there.
And so, if there's an Aspergillus failure, let's say.
Aspergillus.
Aspergillus.
Okay.
Soft G. Or there's been some major pesticide issues in the California marketplace that's been brought to the public as well recently in like the LA Times. as part of doing what you just described of qualifying your materials, asking for lab results of the raw ingredients, looking at the COAs, looking at the SDS sheets, you should know and do compatibility and risk assessments to understand these with these growing practices, these sanitation measures. You're doing swabs to evaluate the microbial content in your facility. You should have all the assurances. GMPs provide all those assurances that when you get to the final product, that it's going to pass with flying colors. I like to look at it as lab testing should really be a formality.
Right.
And these GMPs would have prevented any of those failures.
Right.
Because you would have identified them maybe 4 weeks into the grow or, at the outset.
And so having the confidence, because you already went through the whole GMP process, to know that like everything you're putting out is going to pass because we did all the right steps.
Yeah.
So at the end of it, it's like the COA, like you said, is a formality. I mean, we know we're passing everything because we did everything the right way. So I guess when it comes to, there's all these different compounds like
Aspergillus.
and pesticides and stuff like that that are entering the market through poor GMP. Is like, what, I guess, if you could say to, a person who maybe just started manufacturing their edibles, is there something they can do basic before they have to hire, for instance, GMP Collective to come in? Like, are there any bases they can cover from the very beginning?
I look at it as you are only as strong as your weakest link, and have a cross-functional team. Have a scientist. Bring a food safety scientist on staff, whether it's as a consultant or on staff, and have some. And then there's also educational resources. There's tons of like HACCP training resources and GMP programs out there, which if you're making an edible, it's an edible. So follow the same risk profiles that any other gummy
like a
manufacturer.
Cookie or gummy or something like that.
THC is just an ingredient.
It's an ingredient in this process. So I guess when it comes to like, for the newbie who's coming in, who's like, all right, I got my serve safe, I should be good. Is there obviously lab tests are happening regardless because it's the cannabis industry. But when it comes to tactical things, I guess you're in it. I guess actually you just mentioned one, which is getting a food scientist in, which I think the quick hack might be invite your board of health in to start.
Yes, and there are resources.
There are resources, and that's free. You just don't have to pay them because they want to see also sometimes, right? And I know
it's a shared interest.
It's a shared interest because it's all about food safety to make sure we're putting out products that people aren't going to get sick from. But when it comes to different towns do different things. Some towns just be like, it's the CCC, it's not me. I don't really want to spend time doing that because. And that's kind of what we got during COVID. It was kind of like, I've got other things to do right now.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have to be walking into your facilities. I have no purview into that anyways. But as you kind of start to get more mature, when is the time to call GMP Collective? When is it that time to be like, all right, I got to like jump on the phone with these people because we're kind of growing in a spot where we want to make sure we are doing things the right way?
Honestly, the earlier the better. I mean, everything from the facility design. I've seen so many little things go wrong, whether it's, gypsum walls that are in a room that might get wet and you're going to have microbial buildup. And next thing you know, you realize, why are your products failing final product testing? Because there's mold in the walls. And until you hack the wall out, you don't realize it because you didn't do that testing.
Right.
Like, there are materials, quality by design from the outset.
So is mold always visible?
No, I mean, that's...
Because I always think of mold, I think of like green or black spots everywhere. And I'm like, oh, there's mold there. But you can have it in the air and not have it.
It is in the air. Aspergillus is in the air. Like we live in the, we go outside, there's pollen. Right. Aspergillus. We swim in it. We just don't realize it. Some of these, they're microscopic. Yeah. So by the time you see it, it's too late.
It's way deep into the walls at that point.
Good luck getting it out.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when it comes to, I guess, that stuff, we're fortunate. We were a beverage company, and we had a good architect in that sense because he was saying, okay, for food safety, you have to have these walls, right? And so we have these, it's not FRP, but it's like, a nicer version of FRP, basically, which is supposed to be resilient to absorbing that type of stuff for spills and stuff like that.
And that's part of the key, right? Is just find people that have done this before. Food safety. If you're acquiring a facility, going into an existing facility that was used for production of food, that's a great first step. If you're designing your facility and working with an architect, there's a difference between a residential architect, right, and even just any commercial or industrial architect versus somebody that's actually built a food manufacturing facility. They understand these things, and that's the knowledge you want to have on your team.
One of the selling points for the architect we ended up hiring, who happens to be a local guy too, was that he designed a cannabis facilities in the past already, including food safety ones. So for us, we were kind of just like, all right, that checks a bunch of boxes for us. And fortunately, since he was a local guy, we didn't get the cannabis charge on top of everything because, as you know, every time you say, hey, I'm in cannabis,
risk premium
2x, 3x more now that you have to pay.
Yep.
And so obviously avoiding that was beneficial for us because we're already burdened with so many costs just to get started.
It's so difficult. And then, you think about the regulatory parity and what you've been talking about with like not having more regulations. I think about the hemp space and that is such a charged third rail these days. You can't say that without just having lots of emotions, right? How do we play in this space where a lot of the hemp programs have almost no regulations and oversight? You can produce the same darn product. So what does regulatory parity look like? Let's test smarter, not harder. I think there's a lot of opportunities there to come together.
So let's dive into that a little bit because we actually operate in both, right? And it's funny because I don't talk really much about the hemp side because in Massachusetts, it is really frowned upon. In fact, we may have lost a few of our dispensary partners because they knew we were in hemp. That can't be confirmed 100%, which stinks because we're like the local guys who are trying to do the right thing, who are doing full lab tests, who are only putting it into 21 plus areas, et cetera, et cetera. So for us, we felt kind of like blindsided by it because we're like, no, we're the good guys. We're like trying to do it the right way. And yes, dispensaries want to obviously have that kind of foothold in all cannabis related things or THC related things. But for us, we were kind of just like, we're born from the idea of giving access to people. And it's really just about getting access for us. So we're just like, hey, this is another way we can get our products in front of more people, which they can get the benefits from cannabis. And so from our perspective, we were like, I don't want to step on the stool and be righteous about it, but like we're trying to do the best thing possible for the consumer by doing everything the right way. But we know it only hurt us. It didn't hurt anybody else, which stinks. We're literally the only artifact of that departure because when all the products got removed off the shelves in Massachusetts for hemp, the hemp side of things, and by shelves I mean liquor stores, like you have the big players like a Cycling Frog, a Can, and all the other companies, they can survive stuff like that. For us, that's a huge setback. It cost us tens of thousands of dollars to pull all that product back, and it buried us for quite a while. And our hemp company is still, which is a fraction of our cannabis business, it really hurt. And so it stinks from our perspective, but we roll with the punches. We're still in hemp. We still have our products in hemp, and it is about access for us. And for the most part, we're going to be doing things the right way, regardless of what people think of us, right? But there's a lot of companies out there in the hemp side who are just like, it tested? Yeah, sure. Here's like a fuzzy photocopy of a COA that's kind of blurred out in a few places, and it's just like, what's in here? You don't know.
Right. That's a perfect example of the unintended consequences of, it takes one bad apple, right, to kind of ruin the whole bunch. And so that's what we've been seeing in this space where, I look at what you're doing. I look at, I don't know if you've been to Minnesota where
I've never been to the places, but people are trying to always bring us into it. But I'm like, we're small. We can't afford to be in multiple states all the time.
Yeah, and access to distribution, right? The supply chain channels is a major barrier. So I look at Minnesota where 5 milligrams of THC per serving is allowed now in beverages, and who's producing them? It's the breweries. You've got Surly Brewing, you've got Ben Paddle, you've got all these breweries that understand food safety. They have perfected their craft of beverages, and by adding emulsifiers or et cetera, right?
It's just another ingredient.
It's just another ingredient,
right?
Exactly.
Just like adding hops. It's just like, all right, we're going to add this to this step now, and then we're moving through because we have GMP in place. We're going to make sure that all this gets done correctly. So, and in Minnesota, that has been so successful there. We were like, I hope this can work in Massachusetts and other states as well. So when it comes to and one bad actor does spoil everything for everybody. And I think the big talking point back then was gas station gummies.
And it's still a thing, right? 100%. I mean, that's part of the issue.
And I think there was just somebody got busted with an adaptogenic mushroom gummy downtown
killed
or something like that
so
in Boston.
the FDA has there's these shroomy gummies I know, and this may be the same different-
apparently it contains psychedelic mushrooms in it, or THC. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, I
Like,
think it
something
contained
else
both, and then I forget what the impurity. They're still doing the investigation, but like people have died, people have been injured. Like there's been over I think like 70 adverse events. This is all on the FDA's website.
Wow.
Because of these products are unsafe, and so that's the unintended consequence that we end up with when there are no standards,
Right.
And we're kind of
And you can buy these things online. You could just be like, hey, I'm going to ship them to my house.
To your door.
Or you can actually ship them to the store. You can buy cases of the stuff and just put it up in your store. And I think they're not educated enough. This liquor store owner or wherever, this health wellness stores, they're not
They don't
educated
know what
enough
they
to
don't know.
understand like what a COA is supposed to look like. And so that's an uphill battle for us constantly.
Nor should, to a larger degree, like, should they be? How do we, and that goes back to that original conversation.
So
like,
Stop and Shop.
Yeah.
They have buyers. They hire they have people on staff, to food scientists, to go in and investigate these facilities. A mom and pop bodega on the corner in the North End or something like that isn't going to be sending people to Minnesota to check on these things or whatever.
Right.
Not to pick on Minnesota, but whatever.
Yeah. Use your state, use your
State.
facility.
Yeah.
They don't have the resources and know-how to go in and evaluate whether these products and brands are safe or not.
That raises an interesting question. I wonder if there's a way, like, how do you see a possible way forward with hemp then? Like, what do you see happening? I mean, the government's going to get involved at some point if it doesn't regulate itself.
Look, I'm really hopeful. I think it's not an either or. I think it's parallel pathing of both. There's going to be a federal minimum standard. I mean, that's inevitable. There has to be from a public health and safety standpoint. Industry can also, you don't have to wait. An ounce of prevention is worth so much more, or prevention worth more than a pound of being reactive and cure. So how do you do that? You've got to put these GMPs in place. The cost of a recall or having to have your products removed from the shelf. It's one thing when it's out of your control and legislation decides,
and
you can't have these products anymore.
Pull all this off. Right, exactly.
Versus you actually had an adverse event and have to pull all those products. Having these programs in place is so much cheaper. The brand reputation, et cetera. And so as the industry gets more mature, I'm seeing, Total Wine, for example. My friends just got back from Florida. Buy those THC beverages at the Total Wine liquor stores.
And why not?
Yeah, and so Total Wine has that knowledge and resources where they're not going to just put any product on there. They're going to do due diligence. They're vetting the supply chain because that's a risk to their brand. If a consumer comes
Total Wine
back.
is that the biggest chain of liquor stores at this point?
I believe so. It's like it's multiple states.
Yeah. So going a little further down that path, maybe not on hemp in general, but in just GMP, like when somebody calls you in, have you seen just like horror stories where you're just like, you to change today, like, oh, this is just bad?
Yes, and I can't even
you don't have to name any names.
Where to begin? There's everything from cross contamination, not having.
You give me an example,
It's a good example. I'm thinking about plants most recently that I ran at like a cultivation facility that you could literally the amount of mold on the product. Yeah, it's like you weigh it in mold. Yeah. There's other colas under there.
Exactly.
What else have I seen? Jeez, I think off the top of my head. A lot of it's just like unknowns. People don't realize the risks that they're taking with, say, all right, here's one silly example, and I'll use it as one because it's where there's cost wasted. So they're trying to do everything right. They are like over wearing PPE. They've got Crocs that they go in, so you are allowed to bring your street clothes in. So you wear your Crocs. Yeah. Well, when's the last time they cleaned the Crocs?
Right.
Have we ever? The Crocs were the most contaminated piece in the entire facility, and so they were walking around, and there was microbials.
PPE or whatever. So every time they put PPE on, it's fresh, but the Crocs are just sitting in the locker.
They're spending $1 million a year on a laundering service for their employees' lab coats. To launder all of that and all the PPE, and then the Crocs are the ones that were the vector. They were just carrying contamination throughout the facility. And people don't realize that. Yeah. And you're missing the forest for the trees. You just wasted $1 million on trying to do the right thing when you didn't actually test and just critically think where the risks are.
And I can only imagine the CEO being in that situation, be like, all right, we found contaminants and blah, blah, blah. All right, let's spend more money. Let's launder the clothes more frequently. How did it get in? And they're not looking at the feet. Interesting.
I think those are perfect examples of, it may look great on the outside, but you're missing these basic steps, which
it's a trained
brainstorming exercise. Yeah, it's a trained eye.
You have to, you just see these things and you're like, all right, you should fix these things, and that'll potentially reduce your risk or eliminate the issue that you had.
It's asking those questions, coming in with a fresh lens, like, well, why did you get contamination? Doing a little bit of data collection, like do test swabs, understand where your source is. Don't just, I think this is where it's at, and I'm just going to throw, people are just throwing money at problems.
Yeah.
And
we have the swabs.
Really short-sighted.
We have the swabs here. So we do swabs.
Awesome.
We swab everything, even our inside of our bottles and stuff like that, of our tincture bottles, because, we have a storage space, right? And that storage space is a storage space. It's not really a production facility. And so we noticed that some of the bottles were opened, and the box was open and someone left it open. But we're like, we need to test that, because if there's microbials in there, we're now just contaminating that. Even if you run it through SANI, something could happen still. So we're like, let's just test them. We found it basically would be a non-detect on a proper COA, or be under some kind of limit. But like, there was a little bit of something in there, like, all right, there you go. Like, we can't keep the bottles uncovered in here. We have to keep them still in their original packaging. Once you crack that open, it has to go into the production facility at that point, where it's even more sterile. So yeah, we see that stuff all the time on our end. But I figure that's because, to a certain extent, we've heard of those horror stories before. We're just like, well, you've got to swab everything, because you just don't know where it's going to come from.
You don't know.
Yeah.
How
it's
else
in the
do
air.
you know?
Yeah, you just said it. It's in the air. We're breathing in and out of our mouths right now. We're exchanging Aspergillus.
Aspergillus. At the end of the day, we'll get this. The audience is all learned a new word. Aspergillus.
Okay.
You got it. Yep.
Let's get to your other company. So, and we can maybe round up with GMP again. But how does, like, you started these other two, one being a nonprofit, and then, but it's not a company. I'm sorry, you're part of the ASTM board.
And then I'm on the ASTM's Cannabis Committee board as well.
Okay.
Yep.
What does that mean? Like, ASTM is a standards
development organization.
Is it like a quasi-government agency?
So it's a private 501c3 nonprofit. They work closely with the federal government. Actually, 93% of their committees have federal and state regulators as part of it. Actually, like, working hand in hand to develop the standards.
Does
it's a
GMP and
congressional
ASTM,
requirement.
like, does that go together some way? Or ASTM is really the standards. It's just like, hey, here's the things you have to do.
Yeah, ASTM churns out. So take a Sharpie, take a crayon, take your crayon box at home, and you'll see conforms to ASTM D4236. That is the standard, so that your kids, when they, because maybe eat a crayon, put in their mouth as their kids, and they're not going to get lead poisoning, because the standards have been established via ASTM's consensus process.
Is ASTM older than GMP then?
ASTM is 125 years old.
Wow.
They've been doing this for railroads.
1898.
18. They just celebrated their 125th anniversary.
So what was the first thing they had to? Was it railroads?
Railroads.
They were just like
the T-rails.
Yeah.
Yep, the T-rails. So imagine back in the day when we were actually starting before we had cars and well-established roads. It was all rail. Well, what's the quality of the steel? What if these rails don't last for forever? Or
even
what's the percentage of copper, percentage of molybdenum?
How about the shape?
The shape.
Because if you're on rails, because I'm an engineer.
Okay.
So,
so you get.
No, I don't. I say I'm an engineer because I study computer science and I was a software engineer, but I'm not an engineer. But the railroad tracks matter, obviously, because now you're talking about interstate transport of all these goods or people, and as you're going through it, when you cross into a new section that's owned by a different company, like B&O Railroad versus some other railroad company, B&O, I don't know how I came up with that. I used to have trains when I was a kid, but when they cross over, they have to obviously conform to a standard, because otherwise you could derail them and like cost obviously millions of dollars in damage.
Exactly. You nailed it. So it underpins all of our infrastructure, our roads, different grades of asphalt, wires. USB is a standard, right?
Yeah.
How we're so grateful that we don't think twice. There's USB, there's USB-C.
I'm not going to get shocked or something like that by plugging this thing in.
But somebody had to come together and agree, regardless of whether you're Samsung or Apple or name, HP, that all these outlets are going to work the same.
Right. Well, so how does that apply to cannabis then? Like, what kind of standards are being developed for cannabis right now?
So there is a whole suite of standards. Think about, vape pens or even can liners. There's a couple ways to think about this. One is we have the opportunity as an industry to create these standards. So that's really the process to get ahead of it.
Before the government comes in and says, hey, we're going to do it this way.
We can write the framework and say, this is what matters. So, vapes are a really hot topic issue. What about the hardware? What are the performance components? Is the ceramic coil actually shedding silica flakes at all? Do we have to have a required temperature in the kiln for adhering the ceramic pieces for the heating coils?
When they reheat, it could shed particles or something like that. Now,
what are the metal requirements in it?
You're inhaling ceramic particles into your lungs. Wow.
So we need a standard for that, a performance requirement, and an establishment of, what are the amount of impurities that are allowed there. And then we can do a puff test from there. What's a standard puffing regime? Is it at 400 degrees C, 200 degrees C, for 5 seconds, for 10 seconds? What's a standard dose? And what's the acceptable levels of impurities that are coming into those vapors?
Yeah, so when you're thinking about cannabis, ASTM exists, standards are being created. Who's enforcing that? Does ASTM have an enforcement side?
So ASTM is just the body that...
They write the rules or the policies.
They create the process for us to to develop the standards within. From there, so for example, 12 states have adopted ASTM standards in different parts for cannabis specific. So they can get adopted, incorporated by reference, it's called, where it's directly written into rules or law. So for example, what's a good one? In the state of Colorado, so there's a HACCP. We talked about HACCP earlier this morning. We'll bring it back. Same, not bring on a new acronym for us. And so the committee developed a standard guide for conducting and using a HACCP program for cannabis products. So the state of Colorado, through their rulemaking process, incorporated by reference, D8250, which is the HACCP standard for any manufacturer that wants to have a reduced testing allowance.
Okay.
And so they just reference it directly there. And so the industry now knows if you want to meet and get that reduced testing allowance, you have to have that HACCP plan.
Yeah, because HACCP is a hot topic. That is something that we've definitely discussed.
Another really important one, right? A universal symbol.
Yes.
So by virtue, the fact that we have, I think, 18 or 19 different symbols across the country, it's not standard. Imagine if our stop signs were squares in one country or one state and an octagon in another and red in one and yellow in another.
So that's a standard.
That's a standard.
So the demarcation of the cannabis. So show that again real quick. Let me see it. So that's the one that is being recommended. That's the ASTM standard.
This is the ASTM standard.
Chris Fontes.
Yes, the Trojan horse.
Yeah, Trojan. He is on everybody. Adopt the standard. I think he's also on the board for that particular thing. So he's very much.
He's been a great advocate of the ASTM D8441 standard.
Yeah. So
5 states have adopted it.
We've adopted that one for our hemp products. We haven't because Massachusetts has its own.
Massachusetts requires a different one.
I personally like the Massachusetts one's better. I don't understand why it went to yellow versus the red and white. What was the decision-making process? Just because I have you in front of me, and I've been curious.
This is a whole series of conversations that went on for almost a year.
A year-long conversations.
Imagine that. Yeah. So they did a consumers. They did a survey. They put surveys out, and one of the questions is, well, what does red mean? Red means stop, right? What does yellow mean? Proceed with caution. So what's the intent of this symbol? Is cannabis something that is dangerous and you should stop and not use, or is it something that you should be aware of and proceed with caution? And so that was the discussion that came around to resolving from a consensus standpoint. It's got to be yellow.
Clip that. Yeah. That's amazing. I literally have been so curious about that because I was like, I kind of like the aesthetic of the red and white, and to me it stands out. But red means stop, yellow means proceed with caution. That's perfect. I'm excited to adopt that. I think everybody should at this point because we have to get on the same page everywhere. We need standards.
Thinking about the hemp conversation we had earlier. So last week, depending on when this airs, recently the Wyden just announced the cannabinoid. I forget the name of the standard, CRSA, and it's to essentially try to address a lot of the shortcomings with the gap between the Farm Bill and the end user of consumer products, intoxicating hemp-derived products. And they reference the ASTM standard in that bill in Congress, as well as good manufacturing practices as the 2 minimums that everybody should adopt so that, to be clear, right, this is for intoxicating cannabinoids, not just
CBD.
If it's CBD.
Yeah.
So any product that is containing potentially intoxicating cannabinoids, consumers should at least deserve the right to know. Just
Right.
put it on there
Right.
so that they're aware.
They're aware of
That's
what's
the goal
in
of a
it.
symbol.
So if we see federal legalization, is it immediately going to be like GMP switch on? Like everybody has to have ASTM standards, all your packaging has to change. And then like, is there just going to be like a huge tidal wave of changes that every state's going to have to adopt?
I don't think so. I think this is an incremental journey. There's no telling what the federal government's going to do. This is up to Congress. So wherever you are, you've got a local congressman, you've got a local senator. Be talking to them about the policies you want. Understand, educate yourself. Work with, if you're in industry, work with trade associations to understand the messaging that they're representing, because it should be an incremental, phased approach, right? And we have the ability to do that. There's multiple. We've got CANRA with 45 states. That CANRA is the Cannabis Regulators Association. They're essentially the trade organization of all the states,
All the regulators, yeah.
working together to try to figure this out. Then we've got the FDA. We've got Congress that has to unlock the federal framework and allow for, create the framework for us to have those rules. So let's have a GMP light program. I think GMP can be scary.
Okay.
Let's think about GMP light. This doesn't have to be
nice.
right.
Sounds like a dream. I can't wait to do
It can be
GMP
your
light.
dream.
Yeah.
Like it can be reality.
Right.
It's risk reduction.
Right.
And adopting these ASTM universal, like the universal symbol, is the best way to get consensus and have a federal framework.
Yeah, and risk reduction for
That's all
us
this
is extremely important because we see risk reduction as revenue generating because that means that we're doing everything the right way. We're not going to have recalls. We're not going to have any adverse events that we're going to have to be able to now eat thousands of dollars worth of product. So 100% agree with you there. So GMP light though is interesting, kind of like in between, is it?
Yeah, I think of it as an in-between, like we can create what that is. So for example, through ASTM, and the gentleman who actually created this standard, who led the development of it, he was a former, he worked for the FDA for 27 years in the Food Safety Center. He's a microbiologist, PhD. He worked on the Food Safety Modernization Act. Shout out to Stephen Gendel. He led the development of the standard guide for good manufacturing practices for products containing cannabinoids. And so it's the principles, how you adopt them and how you make sure, what does clean mean? Clean, easily cleanable walls that are non-porous, right? Those are all the things that you get to make the decision around to meet that spirit. And so it's not overly prescriptive. We've got to crawl, walk, run, because the industry's been around for a decade plus. And the product's relatively safe. It's not cannabis we're worried about.
Right.
It's those contaminants.
Stuff, the contaminants that everybody's worried about now. I mean, that was the vape crisis, back
with the Valley
2019 or whatever it was, where it's just like, okay, is there lead in the cartridges? Is it vitamin E acetate?
Vitamin E acetate.
There's like so many different ways that you can kind of like figure out what's going on here. And I actually don't even know. What was the conclusion on that?
So it was, vitamin E acetate, but it wasn't just
VapeGate?
Valley, yeah,
Valley?
and why am I forgetting what that stands for right now?
But that
something
was,
acute
that was,
lung injury.
Was it wasn't just Massachusetts. Massachusetts got impacted because they pulled all vapes at that point.
Massachusetts was the first and I believe only state where the governor had actually had banned all vapes in the regulated markets. From my understanding, nothing has proven this otherwise. There's been no link to regulated products with Valley.
So
it was unregulated legacy products that were using these other, agents.
There's no standards, and they don't have to be beholden to any agency or government or regulator.
Right.
So they were just like, we're just going to make a bunch of products.
And because there's been no answer, right? Like we're all figuring this out as we go. So nobody before has asked the question, like say the World Health Organization of, what's a safe level for XYZ ingredient? We're putting these in our lungs if it's a vape product. It's different than ingestion. There's no framework for this besides tobacco, and we're not tobacco.
Right, we're not tobacco.
We don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, and to be fully clear, cannabis is safe. We're not worried about cannabis. We're worried about all the other things that come along with it, potentially with bad manufacturing practices. All right, fantastic. So a little bit of roundup on just really quickly, or as slow as you want. It's a freewheeling show here. How did the nonprofit play into all of this? Because you're already busy enough. You're on the board of the ASTM standards for cannabis, and you're also running a CEO of a company called GMP Collective. The nonprofit, where did that come from? Like you just saw a gap in the market, or I mean, I say market because I'm a capitalist businessman. I'm like, where's the opportunity?
Right.
But you were like, I'm going to do nonprofit.
I saw a gap because what I saw is we have this patchwork state program. The industry doesn't have the resources or know-how or organization to get out of the way and produce all the data that's needed. We're essentially doing lab experiments on everybody right now with all these new novel products.
Active lab experiments.
Yeah.
Well, especially if you think about all the conversions that are happening in labs, such as HHC and THC-O and all that stuff. And I know that stuff's been slowly being banned throughout the country. But that stuff gets really scary because you're just like, none of this has been tested before. And yeah, people are like, well, it exists in the plant, like a fraction of percent. But I'm like, does HHC, a hydrogenated version of THC, exist in a cannabis plant?
Right. It doesn't.
So.
There's no evidence that it exists naturally.
We got all these Franken-Cannabinoids out there, and we're just not sure what they do. So we're just trying to figure out. And then, and we are, and again, because we know the market moves faster than the science. The science is always behind, and the policy is always behind that. So from my perspective, I'm looking at it as, we know Delta-9 THC exists in the plant. We know if you without the conversion, but if you do the chromatography and extract it out of CBD crop, like you can get high levels of Delta-9 THC from that, regardless of how much CBD input you have to use, input. But when it comes to, I'm going to shout out this name, and I mean this in the best way possible because I love what they're doing. And I think it is safe. From the way it works, I understand it to be safe, but I'm curious what your knowledge is on this or your perspective. Specifically, Smoke-N-All. Have you heard of Smoke-N-All?
No, I have not actually. No.
So basically, their tagline is they smoke it for you. So they'll take the plant and they will use a vacuum chamber, an oven, vacuum oven, and they'll actually use a selective filter to be able to filter out all of the maybe the non-desirables of the plant, such as the like the plant matter itself, right, versus the cannabinoids, and they'll selectively take out all the plant matter and leave left over the cannabinoids that are left over. But they're totally new cannabinoids because it's been combusted at that point. So for me, I'm like, you're inhaling that anyways if you were just to smoke a joint,
right?
Or hit a bong. So that all those cannabinoids already exist, but they're not in the plant. It's just something that's already been converted through combustion. So like, how does that?
So they're taking flower, like cannabis biomass, and putting it through a vacuum chamber and decarboxylating it. So
beyond, they're smoking it specifically.
Yeah, they're combusting it. Yeah, they're like
so it's decarbing it, but it's like taking whatever you inhale, but they're putting it into a concentrate instead of into your lungs.
Okay, so it's almost like the joint that you would light and inhale. They're just bottling that up.
Yeah, if you think about it, if you were to put like a vacuum on, like if you put a joint on like a little tip with a vacuum attached to it, and they could extract out the cannabinoids and leave all the plant matter behind.
So it's being combusted instead of heated like a volcano.
Right.
Interesting. Well, isn't that if that's what we're doing, right? Because the question always is what's in the flower? What happens when you heat it, right? When you burn it, it changes a state. So what are we actually inhaling? If there's trace pesticides or a solvent in there, is that turning into a benzene ring compound? What's the safety of that?
Potentially be even more concentrated now because now
you're getting more concentrated
to be able to concentrate it down even to smaller amounts.
Yeah, so like I'd give a shout out to, there's the Cannabis Research Coalition. I don't know if you've heard of them. Dr. Allison Justice, Mayabi, I'm totally going to butcher her name, Shields.
Yeah,
and
Shields.
Rachel Kirk.
Yeah, so
they're doing this type of research, I believe.
Yeah, because they were related to Smoke-N-All. So I know Andy and Miyabi go way back.
Got it. All right, that is awesome. I bet maybe I did just see and I just forgot the brand was Smoke-N-All. So they're doing this research to understand what's actually what's in the vape stream, because nobody's in the smoke stream, because nobody's asked those questions.
Right.
Those are fundamental questions we need to ask.
Interesting question, because it's like people don't think about it. They're like, oh, I'm gonna get high, I'm gonna have some THC, and when you combust it and it goes into your lungs, I've seen a chromatography graph from Andy, and it's just like nobody knows what these compounds are. Is there one of them or two of them or 1,000 of them, or not 1,000, but maybe there's like dozens of them that are like very beneficial for specific things, like Crohn's or cancer or whatever. Because smoking changes it in a way that actually allows the chemicals to convert it to something different and that are more beneficial. And you can eliminate the bad ones and keep the good ones, but Miyabi and the team are working through to figure out what that actually means.
Because we've never asked those questions. And if you think about like characterization of the product, how do we differentiate products out there? What's the difference besides branding? You know, beverages and say edibles are maybe a little bit different because
like CPG at that point. You're
that's
just
CPG.
like on a shelf somewhere.
But if you're a flower or a vape pen and you're a strain, what makes your strain better than the other 700 cultivators across the country that are also growing the same strain? What are those chemical profiles? What's the consistency there? What level of consistency do we need?
Right.
We need to first characterize it and know it's in there.
Yeah, some people are working on the consistency side, and other people are just growing cheetah piss. I mean, not to bash on cheetah piss, but it's like the strain names are kind of out of control right now, and I'm just like, how is it attractive to anybody? I get what you get, but people are looking for a specific. In many cases, the people I've spoken to, because I've been doing a lot of consumer research lately, some people are looking for specific effects. They want the sativa, right? And people are still hung up on these terms, even though they're ancient at this point, and maybe the nomenclature itself needs to evolve to type 2, type 1, type 3, whatever. But I'm looking at it as people who are on the genetic side and breeding programs are trying to develop these new strains, like we don't know what that's going to result in when you actually combust it also. So it's like, it's just the science is, it's like it's market. The market's driving all this innovation, which it should, but at the same time, but there has to be standards for safety involved.
Because these are consumer products that we're consuming, ingesting, inhaling. And if you're a medical patient, especially too, and you're immunocompromised, stuff's really important. Or if you're taking it for seizures or some other, Crohn's, and you have 1 week you go to the dispensary and the product, if you have seizures, goes from say 100 seizures a week to 20. Then the next week, it's the opposite. It has no effect because there's no consistency.
Maybe their mother got damaged. They had to start from scratch with some genetics. They pop some seeds, and all of a sudden, it's just like it's different now.
Yeah,
But what are those compounds that are making that different is super interesting.
We have to ask those questions. Coca-Cola tastes the same no matter where you go. There's different flavor variants in other countries because of the customer research and the profiles. They've slightly tweak those ingredients to optimize what the persona of the customer
audience is. Right.
So we should be doing that with cannabis as we mature. We're just in a mature market. The novelty's still there. Oh my God, I can get high. I can buy a beverage.
Right.
I'm sure some of your first formulations tasted terrible compared to now. Like you've probably come a long way. But how do you get there? The 409 story always comes to mind of, the old adage that like it was the 409th experiment. You don't just nail this out of the park. Off the bat.
That is one of the things that we're really good at. And, I talk to people in CPG sometimes and they're like, well, you can't take that approach because this is CPG and you make Coca-Cola and it's Coca-Cola. And I'm like, but from a tech perspective, I iterate. I get better every time. I'm just like, how do we make this better and better and better? And our original beverage enhancer formula has probably gone through 5 revisions at this point, to the point where we think it's the best tasting beverage enhancer we've ever made. And then our syrups were like a byproduct of that in the beginning, because we were testing all these different new technologies. We were like, well, this one tastes way better, but it's not as fast. But the most fast one have those bitter compounds. There's other things involved that make the cannabis taste a little bit not as good anymore. And so we were like, well, for our beverage enhancer, we were like, well, we'll keep that low dose. We'll keep it super, super fast. And for our syrups, maybe we'll be, instead of 3 to 5 minute onset, we have like a 15-minute onset, but it'll taste way better. So we're like, all right, we'll table that for now. We had this Good Vibes a year before we launched it. We have like a backlog of 60 or 70 different products right now. We could launch at any time. And it's just up to us to determine, like, hey, how do you want to approach it? Like, because some require special machinery, equipment, which some of what we have. Sometimes it requires an interpretation of the compliance and the regulations itself, because we're just like, and again, we're innovating, we're always trying to go for, but we're always trying to iterate and get better and better every time we release a new product. We try to learn something, we try to iterate on top of it. Getting back to your nonprofit, because we went way off topic here. How did that come about?
So everything we've been talking about here, who's going to do the research? How do we get the regulators? How do we create a federal framework if we don't have any data to support that? What are those minimum standards if we say we're going to have interstate commerce, whether it's a universal symbol, whether it's what pesticides should we be testing for and at what levels? Somebody needs to bring regulators, academia, and industry all together with data to create that. And a trade organization can't do that because they're the trade organization. They're biased.
They're biased.
You've got a commercial interest as a capitalist, right? The regulators, people don't like it when the regulators just tell you what to do.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like, I want to say in this.
Right.
Academia, how do we connect all the great research going on? And there's like 100 universities with some sort of cannabis programs, and there's dozens of research institutions now that are studying cannabis. Now that there's more funding becoming available, how do we connect that so that the policy questions that need to be answered with science that are maybe holding back the industry from creating, these products defined as safe, we can bridge that gap and connect academia with policy to steer that research.
Got
And
it.
so we're trying to like bridge that gap and bring
Right.
all of the organizations together.
It's almost like you're facilitating it.
We're the master
Facilitators.
orchestra.
Yeah, the orchestrator.
It's like
So-
ASTM, right? They're standards organization. They provide the process and the framework for us. But how do I get Jason to know that ASTM exists and to show up and to vote and to put that standard forward? And then now the standard exists. How do people know that it exists and how to use it? How do we educate policymakers or you around the great question, red versus yellow? Why?
Right.
We've got to do that messaging campaign and show them that all that data exists
Right.
to inform them on why this standard makes sense.
Are there some regulators or some groups in Canada, individual states or wherever that just get it and they understand it? Is there like, what percentage of them, is it like 20% understand it or 50% understand it and the other 50% have to be kind of like dragged along with it? Like,
I'll be honest. I would say from my experience, and I've been grateful to get to work with Canada quite a bit. I've been to their last, they do annual external stakeholder meetings every year. And so I've been there on panels with them every year. They get it. I'd say by and large, they get it. It's a matter of, this messy political world we live in. Can they adopt it? Do they fully understand how does that messaging get transferred? Maybe the commissioners might be there, the executive directors, but they're not the ones working in the department making the rules. So it's a process, and they have to have inputs, or maybe they have the regulations or the legislation has already told them what to do. You shall test for these pesticides. Sometimes they write that into law, and so they may want to adopt the ASTM standard, but their hands are tied.
yeah, now it has
So
to
we're
go
just breaking that
through
down.
the state Congress to get anything changed. To be like, oh, we actually when we first when we first did the rulemaking, we believed these things, but we've evolved and now ASTM standards exist, and so we should adopt those instead. And that's an 18-month process between anything.
And the other part is, we've created these standards. So the committee's been around since 2017. We have almost 60 standards now. It's amazing. But they were created without the input of Canada. They weren't there at the table. I've been working to get them there. They're really, I would say, here in earnest in the last year and a half. So now it's a matter of going back. These standards are living, breathing, because we're learning more, right?
Yeah.
We're always innovating. So let's look at the standard from 2019. Does it actually serve us? Does it work for the regulators?
Yeah.
Maybe it doesn't. So we need to go through that process, which takes time and resources to get the feedback and to build consensus so that then more states can adopt it.
Yeah,
it's a
'cause
journey.
I'm thinking about the next state that legalizes, right? Whatever that next state's going to be. When that happens, Canada, they're probably being trying to even recruit them into Canada because they're like, hey, you're about to go.
Yep.
You need to get ahead of this. So be part of this group. And of course, there's no budget because budgets mean something because there's no budget yet. Even
Right. Who
created
gave
for
them
this.
the
There's no-
appropriations for
yeah,
this?
so
Yep.
you almost have to give them pro bono support up to that point, and then when it flips, then they become full members or
Yep.
something.
How do we help hold their hands
Yeah.
and share that information for them? Who's the single source of truth? Who can they trust?
Exactly. Yeah, and who do you even go to? Because I think what was it in Massachusetts? It was the treasurer was in charge of appointing the commissioners initially, or something like that, and then, but the point being that it's policy making seems like such a giant mess.
It's
And
so
it takes
difficult.
so long to get anything done, but you're hopeful.
I'm really hopeful and positive. I think major kudos to Canada. The fact that they have an organization where the regulators can now talk, because 10 years ago, the commissioner in Massachusetts, or say the person doing rulemaking, couldn't just pick up the phone and call the state of Colorado and call
yeah, how are you
Washington.
guys
Who
doing
do you
over there?
call?
Yeah.
How do you even find that person? Now there's infrastructure where they can send a message out, and we've got 39 other states. It's a numbers game. 7 other people will be able to chime in and say, I learned this. I know this. Don't make the same mistake that we did. Here's why.
Yeah, if I had any message for regulators, and it's too late in some cases, if I had any message to regulators that are trying to support businesses in Massachusetts and the surrounding areas is that New England should be a consortium. We should all have the same rules here because whenever federal legalization comes through, interstate commerce. I'd love to ship products to Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, we'll say, go for your don't. And then into Maine and stuff like that. Because I know Maine and Massachusetts have similar rules.
Same symbols.
Same symbols
Yep.
and stuff like that. So like similar because Maine was based, I think, a little bit on Massachusetts. So it's like we're so close, but at the same time, we're so far away. Like Connecticut has strange rules with their regulations where it's like your packaging has to be black and white. You can't use strain names. You have to use like some kind of robotic name that ChatGPT generated.
Yep.
So for my perspective, I just wish they could all get on the same page because now you're talking about if we can get interstate commerce done as a New England component, and then we can go to the tri-state, we can go down the East Coast or to the West Coast or whatever, like that would lend itself way more to the commercial side of it, which I get isn't the end all be all because a lot of the research still has to be developed, but for the safe products we've already
But that's
been putting into
inevitable,
market.
right?
Well,
it has to happen.
I mean, yeah, and I guess just to round up the conversation, when federal legalization happens, GMP light is a thing, potentially, if that's being defined, or when it gets defined. Is that how do you, what's your dream state scenario if federal legalization happens? Or are you actually just waiting for Schedule 3 to happen, and then when the EA reschedules, hopefully at the end of this year, that flips another thing in your business because the opportunity for you might go way through the roof at this point. Now you're hiring like 50 bodies to be able to go across the
to help
country.
educate everybody in the masses
be like,
to
hey,
meet these standards.
Exactly. So all the regulators, not regulators, but all the states that are already legal, you have to go into those states and be like, hey, now you've got to come to your standards now.
And that's why it's GMP light and iterative in my eyes. Like none of this is going to happen overnight. We're going to slowly get there over time. I think one thing is I'll share a story, an analogy from one of my consultants. So he's been in the quality space for 40 years. OTC, right, over the counter products, like your generic Advil, aspirin, et cetera, cosmetics and drugs. And process validation was a concept that came out that's been in pharma for a while. Is coming down to OTC and cosmetics. They're like, we don't do this right now. We don't validate that our processes, do what they say they're supposed to do. We just rely on the final product testing. Well, pharma's reports were like 500 pages. They're very sophisticated, lots of statistics, lots of data being collected, tons of scientists, lots of number crunching. You don't just go from 0 to 500. Right. You do the rule of 3. You can get, some statistical numbers around, the variability, standard deviation with a number of 3. So just run 3 batches. You get a simple 5 to 10 page report. Crawl, walk, run. We've got to start somewhere. It's better than nothing. So that's where I see the marketplace going. The only way we get, that compact idea that you said is by having the same standards, of playing field, so that you can ship products between states. If you have to change your whole packaging, so we need minimum packaging rules, we need minimum processing standards and safety standards.
That's one of the things we're faced with hemp right now is the fact that our packaging doesn't conform to certain states, and so we can't sell in those states.
And that's such a mess, right?
It's like we do our best and we hire the best attorneys to be able to say like, all right, this is 90% of the states should accept this packaging. But then certain states like Louisiana, for instance, they require you to register and submit their packaging before you can even sell anything, right?
Prior approvals versus,
exactly. And then you've got other rules in like Connecticut where on the hemp side, the cannabis side is bizarre, but on the hemp side, it's also, they just put those rules in place where you can have a 4-pack. It can't contain more than 3 milligrams per, and again, I'm thinking beverages. You can't have more than 3 milligrams per can. There's no such thing as a multi-serving can. It has to be 3 milligrams, 3 milligrams, 3 milligrams, 3 milligrams. So 12 milligrams per 4-pack. But it doesn't say how many 4-packs you can buy. But it's a 4-pack. Like you can't put a 6-pack out, but you can put a 4-pack out and buy 34 packs if you want to.
Which from a production standpoint, if you're making, say the other state requires 6-packs only, that's a different canning line. That's a different line. Lines set up. That's different cardboard
and stuff like that.
Different packaging.
Yeah, so that is a little bit frustrating, and which is why it's like getting kicked out of Massachusetts was really a kick in the pants for us because now it's just like, all right, so all these other states have all these different rules, and now we're trying to comply to all this stuff, and so we have to pick and choose our battles wisely because it can be very expensive if you do a batch and all of a sudden you can't sell it anywhere.
Right.
That'd be the worst case scenario.
Yeah. So imagine a world where, just like the food world, it's the same packaging standards, same labeling standards
Nutrition
nationally.
facts
Nutrition
have to
facts.
be there and all this other stuff. Yeah.
The symbols are there. Yeah. You know, fluid ounces,
Yep.
standard sizes. We need all of that to have an infrastructure that's predictable and can work for a supply chain.
Right, exactly. Because we're talking about a lot about innovation and trying to do new things, and it's just like, well, without the standards in place,
Which are guardrails.
you have no guardrails, so you run a risk. There's so much more risk involved with it because
Everybody
you don't have a
loses.
standard to comply to.
Yep. So the regulators are organized. We've got a single voice. It's a challenge to get 45 states. It's just as much a challenge to get all the good feels of the world, right? All of the industry, get the marijuana industry or cannabis industry together. Hemp has their perspectives. We need to work together. That's the only way we're going to solve this. We can't be working in silos, and that's what we're facilitating. So that's how we'll get to a federal, minimum framework.
Fantastic. Wow, this has been extremely enlightening. Anything else you want to add before we wrap?
The last thing I'll add that comes to mind is, well, one, thank you so much for having me. This is awesome. I've been so grateful to get to know you since I think we first chatted in like 2020 or 19.
2019 NECAN or something like that. You were giving a presentation, and I remember I was sitting in it was at like a end cap almost. And you had a TV, and you were just standing up there talking. I came up to you
that's right. Yeah, February 2020 at NCIA's event in Boston.
NCIA.
That's right.
There you go. I thought it was a NECAN, but you're right. It was NCIA.
Yes.
So
that's right.
Yeah, that's the first time I met you. So
talking about not reinventing the wheel. So
you've been on the GMP track since day one, practically.
It's been a journey.
Yeah,
it's been a journey. We're making so much progress, though. I think S3 Collective is going to help bring it together. We've got some amazing founding members. I've got an awesome board. We've been partnered with, or not partnered with, but accepted into the FDA's Network of Experts program. So we're, as a nonprofit, able to work with and facilitate and share information with the FDA to help them better understand where we're at as an industry and share that knowledge. So we've got that framework, we've got the connections coming together. And so I'd say come check out, follow our newsletter, sign up for our list. If you're interested in donating, like we need funding, a little bit is going to go a long way. We're in a major, exciting fundraising campaign. We've got a foundation that has donated. We're working on a couple of other foundations, and we've got some university partnerships that we're being able to announce probably in the next few months. So follow us.
S3.
And this is for S3.
Okay.
This is really my baby these days that I'm excited to get off the ground.
Anybody who's listening right now in the industry should be donating something to S3 at this point, because once we get on these standards and facilitate it across to the regulators, the better off the industry is going to be, and you're going to make way more money once we can get all these rules in place, because you'll have guardrails.
Yep. Look forward to, I think about when 280E goes away, when rescheduling happens, which most likely will happen with Schedule 3. Take some of that 280E savings, tax savings, and invest just a fraction of that percent as a business into science-based standards. Like if we all came together and pooled those resources, we could solve problems that no one company can address on its own together. We can pool those resources and provide those regulations and the policy what we need.
Love it. Thank you so much, David.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.
This is awesome. Thank you, Jason.
You're very welcome.